Okie dokie. We have been discussing spirituality and how does one become spiritual. Today I want to focus on developing a spiritual attitude or becoming holy. I think I may have told you this before, but years ago I worked on this topic and I looked up the word holy in the dictionary. It said, as it relates to holiness. And I looked up the word spiritual in the dictionary and it says, as it relates to the word spirituality. And then you go to the word spirituality and it says, as it relates to the spirit. And you go to the word holiness and it says something like, the product of being holy, something like that. Okay, at any rate, what I want to talk about today is developing a spiritual attitude, becoming holy. That's what I'm going to speak about tonight. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I can hear you, but we all need to mute Arlene. Arlene, mute yourself, would you?
I'm not making any noise though.
I'll mute everybody, don't worry. Okay. She's right, she's not making noise, but I'll mute everybody anyways. If you need to unmute, you can by pressing the space bar or using your mouse. Okay? One of the ways that I like to talk about this topic, I find it humorous, some people might find it offensive, is my live audience of one here is laughing at me already here. One of my favorite books of all time is called A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. And it's written by Mark Twain. Okay. Now, in that book, he talks about the various hermits who are very holy people and all the kinds of things that these people do to reach their levels of holiness. And it's very, 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 very sarcastic. I don't think he approved of those Christian hermits or anything like that. And occasionally I'll even go ahead and read some of it. And I don't know, what should I tell you? I find it kind of funny. But not everybody might find it funny. The reality is, the bottom line is, our spirituality has nothing to do with that, not even as a joke. We know that the Kohen Gadol is not even allowed to perform the kahuna on Yom Kippur unless he's married. Celibacy has no place. Obviously, there's one exception in history, which is Moshe himself, who had to be accessible to talk to God all the time, and God talked to him all the time, so to a certain extent. It was true about Moshe, but outside of Moshe Rabbeinu, it was definitely discouraged, and in fact prohibited. Andy and Greg, are you guys okay over there? Do you need my help somehow? I'm going to unmute you. I'm going to ask you to unmute, actually. There you go. Can I help you? Andy and Greg, you guys okay? Okay. So what does a person who embraces a Jewish spiritual path look like? So it's really interesting is that in Beis Yaakov's today, in Beis Yaakov high schools today, they'll often offer a course that's called the Gedolei Yisrael, which is, of course, a reference to various leaders of the Jewish people, whether those who are presently alive or those who have passed on. And they'll examine their lives and try to learn from their lives. And that's, of course, a very useful sort of exercise. Of course, it's a very useful sort of exercise because why is it a useful sort of exercise? Because it's always good to learn from people who are greater than we are. And what makes them greater than we are? Well, of course, it's their connection to God, and it's their life of immersion in Torah and mitzvos that we can aspire to. And they certainly are spiritual people. Of course they are. So therefore, many people will answer the question of what does a person who wants to embrace a Jewish, or what does a person who embraces a Jewish spiritual path look like? And many people will point to a sage, to one of the Gedolim, one of the great Jews of one generation, whether male or female. But the truth is that it's misleading. Because a spiritual life is the Jewish ideal for every single Jewish person, man, woman, boy, and girl. Adult and child, even teenagers. And Judaism teaches us that we engage in the physical world, whether through our work, through our communal activities, through our hobbies. We strive to elevate it. And so every Jewish person, every single Jewish person, independent of profession or status, has the potential for holiness. The Torah itself gives us a framework that guides us to be spiritual. And of course, a manifestation of that spirituality is becoming holy. But what exactly does that mean? So I'll share a pasuk with you. I'll put it on the chat. It'll be there in Hebrew and in English for those that you prefer one or the other. Whoops. There you go. So the pasuk says, "Vayidaber Hashem Moshe Lemar." This is from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 1 and verse 2. Vayidaber Hashem Moshe Lemar. God spoke to Moshe, telling him, "Daber el kol hadas b'nei Yisrael." Speak to the entirety, to the whole community, to all the people. V'amarta aleim, you should say to them, "Kedoshim tihiyu." You should be kadosh. Ki kadosh ani Hashem Elokeichem. Since I am kadosh myself. Now the translation that I'm using here does certainly use the word holiness for kedusha, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. The only thing that's potentially wrong with that is in terms of how we associate with it. Meaning, if there is going to be a definition of the word holiness that comes from some source that's not Torahic, then it's not necessarily what the Torah means. As opposed to when we use a Hebrew word, so that's what the Torah actually means, and then we can do our best to try to understand it. Does that make sense? There's always a risk of using English words because your association and your perspective, your point of view, your way of thinking about that word might be very different than what the Torah has in mind. So what does the Torah command us here? Kedoshim tihiyu. Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, understands that to be holy means that we should refrain from specific activities that are incompatible with holiness. So what are activities that are incompatible with holiness? Every single one of the 365 prohibitions. So every time we observe a negative commandment or a prohibition, that means that we don't violate it. That means to say we choose to not eat something, we choose to not violate Shabbat. So we choose to observe the 365 prohibitions. According to Rashi, we're attaining some aspect of holiness. And that type of holiness has a Hebrew word associated with it, which is tahara. Tahor, purity. For example, when one has the urge to use improper speech, to speak lashon hara, to speak critically, to speak negatively, to speak in a vulgar sort of way, and yet restrains himself or herself, so he or she is actually considered to be holy. So that's our first meaning of the word holy. By looking at different understandings of the word holy, we're going to, or kedusha rather, we're going to have an artistic, nonlinear presentation of what this word could include. And of course, different people focus on different aspects of kedusha. So the first one is Rashi, who says that we attain a level of holiness or tahara by not giving in, by restraining ourselves when it comes to something the Torah says not to do. The second meaning of kedusha involves actively bringing holiness into the world. The first one was that we could bring purity into the world by not becoming impure. But the second definition, the second meaning of kedusha is to actively bring holiness into the world. This refers to the dedication and participation in spiritual pursuits, otherwise known as positive commandments. The mitzvot aseh, the 248 mitzvot that require an action. And through these actions, we actually sanctify the physical world, directing it towards spiritual goals. When you make a bracha on food, instead of, there's a famous story about some people make a bracha in order to eat, and some people eat in order to make a bracha. You probably have all heard that before. Some people, again, eat an apple because they're hungry, but in order to eat the apple, they have to make a bar priya eitz. Some people are going to eat the apple in order to make the bracha. So these sorts of actions, for example, reciting Kiddush on Friday night, it brings Kiddush into the world. When you recite Kiddush on Friday night, when you light Shabbos candles, it brings Kedusha into your home. It brings Kedusha into your time. So there's space and there's time, or there's time and space. Shabbos, of course, is more about time, but certainly your home environment is going to be about space. That is according to others. So according to Rashi, it's don't violate the negatives. According to others, it's do the positives. Rambam understood the injunction to be holy as relating to both kinds of holiness, Tahara as well as Kedusha. What's a great example of this? Marriage. When a couple gets married, what's that union called according to the language of the Mishnah? Kiddushin, which means holiness, sanctification, the holiness of marriage. That, of course, requires the absolute dedication to one spouse on the one hand and total abstinence from anyone else on the other. So it's got the positive, and then it also has the prohibition. And when a couple observes this in its fullest sense, so then they have Shekhinah. They have God's presence with them. That's holiness. That's the greatest holiness. Barry, you have a question? Yeah. Yeah, you may have to unmute yourself. I tried, but you have to undo yourself. You still have to unmute yourself before you talk.
So if Rashi says that it's refraining from particular activities incompatible with holiness, and we're talking about 365 negative commandments, so the Kadosh you is not a command in itself, is it? It's you would think that it has that command form, doesn't it? That it adds something. It doesn't just reinforce something or take away something. You know, does that make sense?
I think in terms of counting as a mitzvah or not counting as a mitzvah, you know, the Gemara tells us that Torah tziva lanu Moshe Morasha Kilas Yaakov. That Moshe Rabbeinu gave us Torah. The numerical value or gematria of the word Torah is 611, and that's what Moses gave us 611 mitzvot. Obviously, he was a Navi, and Hashem told him what to say and what to do, and how to give it over, and all the details. But Moshe was the one who actually taught the Torah to us. But there are two mitzvot that came from Hashem himself, the first two of the 10 commandments, before we begged him not to do any more.
Right.
Now, those two are considered two out of the, it's 2 plus 611, which equals 613.
Right.
That teaching is a passage in the Talmud in Makos, near the end of Makos. Barry, we learned that maybe about 10 years ago together.
Right.
And it's for that reason that many Rishonim spend a lot of time figuring out which mitzvah is from the 613.
Right.
If you were to go through the Torah itself, you'd probably count 700, 750 mitzvahs. I don't know exactly how many you would count. I don't know that Rashi himself counts Kedoshim to you or doesn't count Kedoshim to you. Even if he does not, but it certainly would be a like you said, give us a deeper understanding and buffer up, if you will, you know, the idea of what it is that we're accomplishing for ourselves spiritually when not violating a prohibition. Okay.
I'd say that the Rambam does count the mitzvos, and I guess it would be interesting to look and see whether he considers Kedoshim to you as a positive mitzvah.
We're gonna look at the Ramban's definition of Kedoshim to you in a moment, and we'll see that it would be very appropriate for him to actually count it from the 613. That's a very interesting point that you're making, Barry. Okay. The next thing I'm pasting into the chat is from the Rambam. The Rambam in the Sefer HaMitzvos. The Rambam wrote a book. I just gave the introduction. Thank you, Barry, for the segue. And he wrote a book of defining the 613 mitzvos. He chooses to include certain categories, but there in the introduction, in Shoresh number 4, he says that the primary method of achieving holiness is fulfilling the mitzvos of the Torah. Kedoshim to you shall be holy, and v'yiskadishtem ve'yisem kedoshim, which is also another verse in chapter 20, verse 7, and chapter 11, verse 44. Sanctify yourselves, and you shall become holy. Heim tzivuyim l'kayim kol Torah. They are instructions to fulfill the entire Torah. It's as if the verse is saying, become holy by doing all the mitzvos and avoiding all the prohibitions. So according to the Rambam, Kedoshim to you, this third understanding of be holy, is that even within the framework of The second understanding, really, because he's the one who introduces the concept of kedusha, of becoming kaddish through the observance of the mitzvos. This idea is really rooted in the Rambam. I just want to add that. Oh yeah, there's a. This kind of goes back a little bit to Barry's point. There's a discussion between the Rambam and the Ramban, Maimonides and Nachmanides. By the way, why are they called Maimonides and Nachmanides? Well, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon was the Rambam's name. Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman was the Ramban's name. And so Maimon is his father's name. So he's Maimonides, the son of Maimon. And Nachmanides is the son of Nachman. I don't know that for a fact, but I think it's probably correct. Okay? Barry, does that sound right to you? I don't know.
So,
Yeah? Okay, so in the first mitzvah of the Torah, and I say first mitzvah of the Torah, I don't mean the first one chronologically, but in the first of the Ten Commandments, what's the first of the Ten Commandments? Everyone knows it. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem your God. Is there a commandment in that verse? Is that verse requiring anything of us? What is the first mitzvah of I am Hashem your God? Myrna, you should probably know this from your Vad.
Well, then it goes on to say, you shall have no other gods before me.
That's the second mitzvah in the Ten Commandments. The first mitzvah is I am Hashem your God who took you out of the house of slavery in Egypt. And then it says, yeah, you should have no other gods. Very good, Andy, that's correct. But that's the second mitzvah. What's the first mitzvah of the Ten Commandments? Well, you could say there's no such thing as Ten Commandments. That's an American thing. The Torah calls it Aseres HaDvarim. The Aseres HaDvarim actually is the language the Torah uses. Herb, you got it correct. Aseres HaDvarim means 10 utterances. Maybe there's no mitzvah in the first one. It's actually probably correct, or at least it's an issue of discussion between Rambam and the Ramban. And according to, I believe it's the Rambam, the first mitzvah is what Herb just wrote to me, which is belief. To believe in God. Anochi Hashem. God says, I'm here. Okay, hey God, I believe in you. Right? There's a dialogue there.
Acknowledgement.
Acknowledgement, yeah, okay. The acknowledgement that there is a creator. That's the first of the Ten Commandments, according to the Rambam. According to the Ramban, there's no mitzvah to believe. It's just and I say there's no mitzvah means it doesn't count from the 613, but of course it's a mitzvah to believe. According to Ramban, Nachmanides, it's not that there's a mitzvah to believe, but the belief is is what the whole system is based upon. Without that belief, the whole thing is nonsense. If you don't believe in God, the Torah is meaningless. It's no better than the Constitution of the United States. If you don't believe in God, I'll say that again. If you don't believe in God, then the Torah is arguably no better than the Constitution of any government, any country. Oh, you could say it's brilliant, and you could say it's interesting. You could say it requires a lot of study. And there's all kinds of things you could say. But without God, the Torah is if the Torah is not divine, then the mitzvahs are arbitrary. You do what you want, and murder may or may not include euthanasia and abortion. Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 40, day 41. It's all kind of up to you. But the reality is that, of course, the Torah is rooted in the fact that God himself gave the Torah. And therefore, by definition, it's all divine. That is what the Ramban says. You don't need a special mitzvah to believe. If you don't believe, there's no Torah. That's a discussion between the Rambam and the Ramban. I'm just bringing it as an analogy in a way here to understand that it could be according to the Rambam, you shall be holy is not a mitzvah in and of itself, but it's kind of an outcome of the mitzvahs. If you observe the mitzvahs properly, so you will be holy. And if you don't observe the mitzvahs properly, then you're going to be lacking in your holiness. We're going to talk more about that soon. There is a third understanding of the word be holy, and in a way it's the most famous, and this is the understanding of the Ramban, of Nachmanides himself. I'll copy and paste it for you in a moment. But just to summarize it for you before we read it together, the third understanding of the commandment, or I shouldn't say the commandment, but maybe in the Ramban's case, I think it's a commandment, to be holy is that even within, listen carefully to this, even within the framework of Torah itself, it's possible to undermine one's spirituality. I'll say that again. Even within the framework of the Torah itself, it's possible to undermine one's spirituality. Accompanying the performance of the commandments must be an appreciation of the spirit of the mitzvah. It must be an appreciation of who we are, what we're here for, etc. The Ramban uses a very specific way to talk about this, which we'll soon see. But it's really just kind of an analogy for the concept. I'm going to copy and paste the English for you into the chat. I'll give you a moment to read it. And as I say, this pshat, this explanation, I think, is the most famous explanation for this mitzvah. Okay, I put it into the chat. Take a moment to read it, and then we'll look at it together.
You lost the sound, Rob.
I'm not talking to you, Jerry. I'm talking to
Oh, sorry.
live audience of one. I'm giving you a chance to look at the chat.
I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it.
Oh, look into the chat box. There should be a chat box where you can access it.
Oh, okay. Where's the chat? Oh, okay. Okay.
Okay, so let's read it together here. Here, we're speaking about a certain kind of refinement. So again, he quotes the verse, and sanctify yourselves, you shall become holy. Just as I'm holy, so too you shall be holy. Just as I am separate, so too you should be separate. The idea here is as follows. The Torah forbade illicit relations. The Torah forbids certain foods. Yet there's permitted marital relations and the consumption of meat and wine. Somebody called me last week. It's a very interesting story. We're all adults here. Everyone can handle the story. Somebody called me last week to ask me a very interesting halachic shaila. She said she is a widow in her 60s, and she's been dating a fellow, and she really likes him. She doesn't want to marry him. She would like to be intimate with him. Is there a way she can do so halachically? That was the question she asked me. That's a really fascinating question. We're not talking about teenagers. We're not talking about college kids. We're not talking about a one-night stand. We're talking about two mature adults in their 60s and 70s who would like to be physically intimate, and they don't want the hassle of getting married. So, Barry, what do you want to say? You have to unmute yourself.
Intimacy requires kedushin. There's no intimacy without kedushin.
That's correct. There's no intimacy without kedushin. Intimacy without kedushin is an illicit relation. So she needs kedushin. And I told her, you don't have to have a wedding. All you have to have is a ring. It doesn't even have to be a ring, although it's customary to be a ring. 2 witnesses. Maybe you should have 10 people so you could have a chuppah.
And a kazufah.
You go to any kollel, you get married in 5 minutes. It's no big deal. You don't have to have a party. There's no Sheva Brachos because there's no Suda with. Maybe there would be a Suda with Sheva Brachos. Maybe it's a halachic discussion. Barry's learning Suba, so Barry's holding in this, right? But you have to get married. If I said if you want to get married, let me know. We'll arrange it. It takes 5 minutes. Well, maybe a little bit longer to write a ksuba, but it's not such a big deal. Apparently, she's been calling around asking a bunch of rabbis this question. They've all told her the same thing. Shocker. Okay. Which is really great that every rabbi's been telling her the same thing. Okay. The Torah forbids illicit relations. The Torah forbids forbidden foods, yet permitted marital relations and the consumption of meat and wine. As such, a person who is a Baal Taiva, that means he has physical desires. Here it says, I don't know how you pronounce it, licentious?
Licentious.
Has an outlet to be lewd with his wife or to have many wives. Potentially, we don't do that anymore. To be gluttonous with food and wine. and to speak as he wishes with all manners of vulgarity, as long as he's not speaking Lashon Hara. For these things are not expressly prohibited in the Torah. So one could be a repulsive individual within the confines of the Torah. The Hebrew is even better. A novel, Bereshus HaTorah. The word menuvel is a word that connotes disgust. It's repulsive. It's nasty. Ugh. Okay, that's a menuvel. You ever meet one? No, I'm just asking. Kidding. Okay, so one could be a repulsive individual within the confines of the Torah. Torah comes along and says, this is prohibited, that's prohibited. This is, you're supposed to do with restraint, that you're supposed to do with restraint. But comes along the Torah and says that when you have restraint, when it comes to the excess, and you don't indulge in excesses, so that is how you become holy. Kedusha means living in the world of God, that is Torah and mitzvos, but doing so in such a way that is holy, not to indulge in excess. There's a couple things come to mind. There's something called the Tainus Haravid. A Tainus, you've all heard that word before, Ta'anit, is a fast. Ravid is Rabbeinu Avram ben David. He was one of the principal commentaries on the Rambam's writings. The Tainus Haravid is to have your meal, but to leave a little bit over at the end, to show that you're the one who's in control of your food. Charlene, do you want to, are you still on? Do you want to chime in on that one? I wonder if you have anything to say about that. The Tainus Haravid.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. Charlene is a physician who specializes in for diabetics, weight loss, things like that. So the Tainus Haravid is, yeah, eat whatever you want. Eat your meal, but leave a little bit over at the end. Show that you're the one who's actually in control, as opposed to giving up the control.
Rabbi, can I ask something?
Sure.
You know me, I've always lamented the schism between Chilonim and Datiim.
Okay.
And you know, I've spoken to you about those who probably fall into the category of Chilonim, that are the salt of the earth.
Yes.
In other words, so the question I have is, can one be holy and perform mitzvot outside the confines of the Torah? In other words, the flip side of what you say. You can be nasty and mean and vulgar and whatever, obnoxious within the confines of the Torah. Mm-hmm. However, you can be a mensch outside the Torah, and you can probably fulfill more mitzvot by even being unaware of it. So I'm not promoting that. I'm just saying that Hashem is there for all of us, for all us Yehudim, and this is where I've had this discussion with myself all the time.
Yeah. So it's a very, very fascinating question, and there's a lot to say about it. And obviously it's complex. You and I, we've discussed this, in the past. A couple things come to mind. Of course, with my COVID brain here, I have to remember what they are. Let me think for a moment here. One thing that comes to mind is, okay, listen to this. Somebody said to Rabbi Dr. Abraham Twersky, he said to him, I don't get it. That guy wears a strimal and he has long payas and he's really frum and he's a domestic abuser. And Rabbi Twersky responded, that's a guy who looks frum, so to say. He looks dati, but he isn't. Okay? That is not a religious Jew. That's not a religious Jew. It's a much longer discussion, Jerry. I would say simply that midos. I'll just say one more thing, which is that midos, or positive character traits. We've talked about this very often at Shul. There's social constructs of being polite, and then there's midos in the Torah. Let's take appreciation. It's polite to say thank you. Appreciation, from the Torah's perspective, is every year on my anniversary, I send flowers to my shadchan. Okay, you ever heard anyone doing that? Because that might be on a whole other level of hakaras hatov, of appreciation. Appreciation is being grateful and thankful is at one level within the social construct, and within the Torah construct, it's at a much, much deeper level, where I could thank the shul for hiring me, giving me an opportunity to teach Torah, to live in Los Angeles, etc. And then I can also think about, hey, who was the one who interviewed me at first? That was, of course, Zach Samuels in Palo Alto when I never even asked him for an interview. So I don't know if you know the story, but all I asked him was, what's going on in Westwood? And he says, oh, come over tonight, we'll talk about it. And when he proceeded to interview me, which, like Hashem runs the world, that's how it came into being. Should I be grateful to Rabbi Brander for having left? On all seriousness. Hakaras hatov, according to the Torah's version of it, goes much, much, much further than the social construct of being polite or being gracious or being grateful. So within the realm of Torah, when somebody has, like my mother was saying, Musar Svarim, but when you study and understand how to be the opposite of the vulgar person from the perspective of Torah, I believe there's much more potential than simply being a nice person, salt of the earth, etc. So I think there's much more potential. That's not to take away from the value of the salt of the earth fellow, who certainly is going to be rewarded by Hashem for all the good things that they do. I hope that's a satisfactory 3-minute response to a very complex question.
Okay. Thank you.
I want to say one or two more things because I know we do have to go to Zach's shir tonight. And this next piece sounds a little bit like the Rambam that we read. Because the Rambam that we read told us that this idea of being holy is instructions to fulfill the Torah. And you become holy by doing the mitzvot. But the Vilna Gaon adds a fourth piece here. And once again, I'll copy and paste it for you into the chat. This Vilna Gaon is probably the only new piece for me for tonight's class that I had never seen before. And to me, it's fascinating. Really, really fascinating. Take a look at it. It's in the chat. Based on a pasuk in Mishlei, Proverbs, Gam below das nefesh lo tov. Without wisdom, Gam below das, without wisdom, nefesh lo tov. It's not good for the soul. That's what Solomon said. What's not good? Says the Vilna Gaon, this means that if a person performs mitzvot without the accompanying Torah study, in other words, an understanding, a depth of what it is that one is doing, not just you're doing it by rote, without kavana, but really you just have no understanding of it. So then it will not be good for his soul. That's called doing mitzvot without wisdom. His soul will not have the pleasure from doing the mitzvot, since he doesn't understand their rationale, and thus does so without enthusiasm. So that's another outcome. Cheshek is desire or enthusiasm. So, according to the Vilna Gaon, so it's true, the Rambam is correct, you have to perform mitzvot, but it's much more than that. It's not just perfunctory actions. The perfunctory actions do not automatically create a strong spiritual connection. The Torah study, it's interesting segue from Jerry's question. Torah study is necessary to discover and understand the enormous depth and meaning of the mitzvos, inspiring us towards spiritual growth. So the spiritual growth, according to the Vilna Gaon, comes from doing mitzvot. And don't forget, we laid the foundation to this class is that the word mitzvah is related to the word savta, which means connection with God. So, again, says the Vilna Gaon, one soul actually doesn't appreciate the mitzvah in the same way that it would had it actually had meaning associated with it. How do you have meaning associated with it? We're learning about it. How do you learn about it? Talmud, Gemara, Halacha, Hashkafa. There's lots and lots of ways. Herb is asking an interesting question, which is, this doesn't really take into account people who couldn't learn Torah because they worked in the field or they had no access to learning. The Gemara Megillah that we recently had in Daf Yomi tells us that there's a special halacha, a special mitzvah for a rabbi to teach the laws and the mitzvot of the holidays 30 days before the holiday. Why? To help you get ready. According to this, it's true. Everyone has different levels of access. No, look, at the end of the day, it's not really, I don't think we need to be apologetic. People are going to have different levels of learning and then different levels of appreciation of mitzvot. That's by definition, it has to be that way. Well, I don't know why it has to be that way, but it's a reality. It's a reality. When I take Tylenol, as far as I know, I'm taking Tylenol. When physicians take Tylenol, they understand which receptors in the brain it's targeting and why it shuts off their nerve endings so that they don't feel the pain and That's life. People understand things at a different level. I'm just saying, and I'm not sure if I'm fully answering your question, but I'm just saying that it is actually the responsibility of those who are learned to share their learning to help connect people. That is actually the responsibility of the rabbis. And I think that's the way it was set up. I think that Yisachar and Shimon and Levi, the various tribes were the Torah, the Kohanim, they were the Torah teachers, and they were meant to make sure that the people were connected. One final point, and then we'll share a little story, and then we'll end. This final point comes from Rabbi Avram Edelstein, who says that every act has spiritual potential. And Jerry, again, this perhaps addresses what you asked. He says, it cannot be that God intended that we wait until we have something that we formally call a mitzvah before acting with holiness. Most of our day is not mitzvah defined. It cannot be that all that God demanded of the holy nation was that they punctuate their day with a few discrete actions, and for the rest we're free to play in the playground that is earth. Be holy. Infuse all your day, especially those things in the vast space between one mitzvah and the next. The key, says Rabbi Gedalia Shor, is the tiny act, and that is we have to regard nothing as trivial, nothing as incapable of being infused with holiness. The Jew sees everything as having potential, every smile, every thought, every morsel of food, every gesture honoring our fellow man, all are fraught with cosmic implications. And that's a very, very beautiful thought, because it's not just when I put on my tefillin, when I kiss the mezuzah. I'll give an example. I just laid down for 20 minutes before this year. Maybe you're able to tell by looking at my face when I started. I don't know. I hope not. Did I sleep because I have this insane drive and desire to sleep and it was something that is inappropriate? Or did I sleep so that I could be awake, so I could teach Torah with alacrity, with joy, with being alive? Or did I simply take a nap because I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore? And I was putting one of my kids to bed. Yes and yes. Okay. I want to share a story with you, and then we'll end for tonight. Rabbi Yaakov, this story is about Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Koleski, who was my Rebbe, my Rosh Hashiva. Those of you that have been in our home on Detroit Street, I took a famous picture of him. It was published in the Jewish Observer. And the story is about him. He was, at the end of his life, the Rosh Hashiva of Ner Yisrael in Baltimore. And one day after Shir, he asked a few of his students to remain behind. And the students gathered around the Rebbe's desk, and he says, I have a special favor for you. So they were like, what could Rosh Hashiva possibly want? Maybe he wanted to ask them whether he had expressed a certain point clearly. Maybe he wanted their help collecting money for a worthy cause. Maybe he needed a ride somewhere. Whatever it was, they said, okay, whatever Rebbe needs, we're going to do. So the Rosh Hashiva said like this, there's a liquor that goes by the name of Kimmel. Has anyone ever heard of that liquor? I haven't heard of that liquor. It's called Kimmel. I want you to buy me a bottle as soon as you can. It's not going to be easy to find. I've tried locating it in a few stores, and they don't carry that brand. Of course, students were surprised. They couldn't understand why a bottle of Kimmel was so important to the Rebbe. It's like asking you to go get me a Dr. Stewart soda or something like that. Or buying a can of Dr. Brown, right? They couldn't understand why this bottle of Kimmel is so important to the Rebbe. But when a teacher asks, the student does first, and asks questions later. So they looked all over Baltimore. They called all the liquor stores in Baltimore, those in the neighboring cities, and nobody carried this liquor anymore. Someone told them, yeah, Kimmel's no longer sold in the U.S. That would explain why we never heard of it. Rav Koleski's son, Reb Nussin, who lives in Montreal, became aware that his father was searching for a bottle of Kimmel. He found it in Montreal. He bought a bottle. and he sent it to his father in Baltimore. So he, of course, the Rosh Yeshiva was thrilled, and he told his students how grateful he was to them for their efforts and to his son for sending the liquor. And of course, and now that they had the liquor, they could finally ask the question, why are you so excited about a bottle of liquor? He wasn't a drinker, by the way. So they built up the courage to approach their teacher. And one student spoke for all of them and said, Rebbe, what was so important about getting this particular brand of liquor? So the Yeshiva said that one of the Iranian boys in Yeshiva just became engaged to a girl also from Iran. And the engagement party is this Sunday. So Klevsky smiled. He said, the girl's last name is Kimmel. He says, I felt that if I brought a bottle of this liquor to the party, it would bring an extra smile to the faces of the engaged couple. Now, who is Rav Kolevsky? Rav Kolevsky is one of the greatest masmidim of the last few generations. Rav Ezer Neuberger, who grew up on 401 Yeshiva Lane, and Rav Kolevsky's apartment was on the second floor, every single night till 2, 3 in the morning, there was pacing going on the floor above him. Because he was always learning. He would open up a sefer before Shachris at 6 o'clock in his house, and he would miss Shachris because he was so engaged in his learning. He was a very unique person. By the way, born in St. Louis, and he served in the military in World War II. His whole life centered on learning and teaching Torah. But yet, in addition to his yeshiva and family responsibilities, he was concerned himself constantly with the plight of the boys and girls who had escaped from Iran. I remember his levaya, and this was a major, major point. They said that Rabbi Neuberger, Zechron Levracha, was like their father, because he was the one who arranged for them to escape or to get out, and then, of course, provide. Yeah. And then Rav Kolevsky was like their mother. He raised money for them. He did all kinds of things for them. So, of course, many of those people now live in Los Angeles, and are very, very special Talmidei Chacham in Pico Robertson and other in Tarzana, really all over LA. So he carried many responsibilities on his broad shoulders, and yet to him it was worthwhile to find a bottle of Kimmel for L'chaim, to bring some extra joy to a couple who was far away from their families. Their families, of course, were in Iran. So in summary, through Torah study, mitzvah observance, and infusing our time with meaningful thoughts, speech, and actions, we build a relationship with God. We become holy, and we actualize our spiritual potential. And we'll talk more about this, practically speaking, in the next few shiurim. This sets the stage, I think, and gives us a deeper understanding of what it means to be spiritual. I thank everyone tonight for coming. I'm grateful to you. Glad we got restarted with the shiur. It's wonderful to be back again. And I look forward to seeing you next Sunday night, B'ezras Hashem. I have no travel planned. Hopefully it'll stay that way. Mirza Hashem. Okay, everybody, have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you,
seeing
Rabbi.
everyone.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.